Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling. We're doing another tier list video today, but this time we are doing the sort of weapons of the Space Marines. This is mainly focusing on the man-portable weapons, so you'll notice that there's no things like Predator autocannons or macro laser destroyers from the tanks and things like that. This is the infantry weapons because if we're being real, the coolest thing about Space Marines is their infantry and dreadnoughts. Though I didn't include any of the dreadnought-specific weapons. Regardless, you get what I mean. Don't know why the chainsword and power sword are so huge. They're images I did not think were that large, regardless. I'm sure there's some I've missed. There's definitely some relic weapons that aren't here, that are used only by specific characters, but this covers most of the general archetypes. And this isn't purely on strength, it's also about looks and how cool they are, and a little bit of their fluff as well. So let's get right into it. First up, we have the chainsword, the classic Warhammer 40k melee weapon. It's completely insane. It doesn't really make that much sense, but that's what 40k is about, isn't it? This huge brick with a bunch of saw teeth on it. The chainsword is ubiquitous among all the forces of the Imperium, but you see it the most with the Space Marines. You know, obviously, assault intercessors, Space Marine sergeants have been wielding these forever, and, you know, assault squads used to wield them when they were still around before they got updated. And even among things like veterans, like Stern Guard veterans, you would still often see chainswords with them. They are the iconic melee weapon of the Space Marines, and are, in general, pretty cool. Of course, nowadays, Astartes chainswords are actually good melee weapons, though for the longest time they were pretty much pointless. They were just there to give you your extra attack for wielding it with a pistol. But I am glad that chainswords now actually have more of a purpose, and I will be giving this an easy S tier. I think anyone can see that. Next up, we have the Power Sword, which is a weapon with a bit of a sordid history, just being a power weapon. They've been through more revisions than almost any other weapon type in the game. But looks-wise, very cool. Obviously, swords are awesome. Though generally, I prefer swords on units with storm shields, which have not very frequently been a thing you can do. Obviously, the Deathwing Knights can do that. The Vanguard Veterans can do that. But not too much else. You don't see the sword and board look too much. I think that's why Blade Guard are so cool, because they bring that knightly aesthetic to the table. And overall, I think the Power Sword is a cool weapon, though I don't associate it only with Space Marines, as this is a weapon used by literally every force in the galaxy. You know, I think you could even make, maybe excluding like the Tyranids and the Orcs, who don't really have a power weapon equivalent, but even then, they still have, you know, enhanced melee weapons, regardless. But I mean, you know, Sisters, Imperial Guard, obviously Space Marines of all varieties, Chaos Space Marines. You just see power weapons everywhere, and power swords especially. That doesn't necessarily take away from them, but on the Space Marine scale, I'm going to give them an A tier, just because they're cool, but they're not as cool as the chainsword in terms of iconography and things like that. Though, will I give them an S tier? Yeah, I will. I can't deny it. I love the Power Sword. I always have liked it. I think it's a really cool look, even though, you know, Power Swords have had, again, pretty storied history, just being part of the power weapon class, going from its own weapon to a generic weapon, back to its own weapon, back to a generic weapon, seemingly endless times. I think that they're still very, very cool. Next up, we have the bolter, which I think we all know where this is going. This also includes things like bolt rifles, bolt sniper rifles, because they all look very similar, just with different barrel lengths usually. But the bolt gun is just so cool. Obviously, bolt gun has had not the greatest history in gameplay-wise. It has been the longest joke running in 40k that bolters on the tabletop are pea shooters compared to what they should be, and have very much gone through periods of being completely pointless to being actually pretty decent. But it's the bolter, right? It's an awesome weapon. It looks cool. Not necessarily the most rifle-like weapon, but who cares? It's huge and blocky. I love the casing. The design is just perfect. There's no wonder this has become the most iconic weapon for the Space Marines, and why it's still in use for so long, even after some of their stranger weapons faded away after Rogue Trader. I can't, in good conscience, put this anywhere lower than S tier, obviously. Now, not everything's going in S tier. Just we've had the first three, of course. Next up, we have the Chain Fist, which is a power fist specially developed to, well, breach bulkheads, but also tear through tanks. Obviously, you saw into the armor and then punch through it. That's the way the Chain Fist works. But Chain Fist has usually been very similar to the Power Fist, surprisingly enough, I guess. Just kidding, of course. But with more of an armor punch, whether that be Armor Bane or just being able to throw extra armor penetration dice, or perhaps like in the last edition where you just got flat damage 3 against vehicles instead of the random damage it usually got. Chain Fists are fine, though in my opinion they're just kind of less cool Power Fists, which isn't necessarily a terrible thing because Power Fists are just awesome. But I'm going to give them a B tier, just because they're not that unique. They're just a slight variation of the Power Fist, and the Power Fist, in my opinion, looks better. It's a more refined weapon, if you will. Next up, we have the Bolt Pistol, which I'm pretty indifferent on. I'm not the biggest fan of the Bolt Pistol, but I don't hate it either. Most of its patterns are fairly whatever. They're really just micro-sized bolters. But they just don't do too much for me. I don't hate Bolt Pistols, but I don't love them either. And they're just, they're whatever. They're Bolt Pistols. No one thinks about Bolt Pistols, and for good reason. I'm going to give it a B tier. It's totally fine, but it's probably going to be at the bottom of B tier. Next up, we have the Grav Cannon. So this is one of the, if not the most recent weapon that the Space Marines field. Because, well, recent, I say, because Grav guns were brought back in, I think, 2014, around the time the Knights came out. So the Grav Cannon, though, is very cool. I love the aesthetic of Grav weaponry. Their interesting nozzle designs make them stand out a lot. And I've always loved that kind of carry for a weapon, the top handle, back handle, that you see on all the Devastator weapons. And in terms of the Grav weapons, I just really quite like them. I'm going to give the Grav Cannon an A tier. I love the Grav Cannon. And pretty much the same goes for the Grav gun. It's just, it feels very right as a special weapon. It looks very unique, and it has a very distinct silhouette. I love the Grav gun. It's just a sick weapon, and I think they look cool. Next up we have the Grav Pistol. Not as high on the Grav Pistol. I think it looks a little too stumpy. Their rounded snub noses don't really help with that, and the lack of any sort of magazine, if you will, which isn't uncommon for pistols, especially energy-based ones. But I just don't think the Grav Pistol does too much for me. And yeah, I'm going to give it a C tier, just because I think Grav weapons should be stuck to for bigger guns, not smaller ones. Next up, we have the Heavy Bolter, and I've said this many times, I love Heavy Bolters. The aesthetic, the giant ammo feeds, or even when they're ammo drum fed, and just the fact that they're big, sort of slow-firing weapons. I have a particular soft spot for things like that. Just big, heavy weapons that have a really, plodding, thudding fire rate. Think of, the HMG on its lowest setting from Helldivers. And just the way the Heavy Bolter works, you stance up and it just starts, laying down bolt rounds. It looks cool aesthetically. It's one of my favorite heavy weapons. If I was building tactical Marines, I would probably always bring these just because they feel right as heavy weapons. They're just so cool, right? They're great. They're great. I love Heavy Bolters. I love them. Obviously, never really been the most standout heavy weapons. They've always sort of struggled for a place. But that's not that important because the truth is they look awesome and they're cool. Giant armored ammo feeds, huge frames, and ginormous ammo. Love them. Love Heavy Bolters. Easy S tier. I'm gonna put it behind the Chainsword though. Next up we have the Heavy Bolt Pistol, which I actually like more than the regular Bolt Pistol. It reminds me a little bit of like a Deagle almost, and having 1 AP does sort of add to that perception. I just think it looks a little bit more, it has more of its own identity, which I think really helps with a pistol. That's sort of paired to a regular weapon. For example, the old Bolt Pistol with any of the bolters, it's just like it looks like the McDonald's toy version of it, which isn't really what pistols should be. The Heavy Bolt Pistol feels more like what a pistol should be. It's a different form factor. It's more slender, a little more compact, and I love the big casing it has. I think it's just an awesome weapon, and I'll be giving it an A tier. And it does help that they're pretty solid at, blowing a space guardsman's head off without issue. Next up, we have the Power Axe, similar to the Power Sword. Pretty storied history here. Power Axes are pretty good in Heresy, though, if you just want cheap AP2. But power axes are totally fine. I've never been the biggest power axe fan. There's only one that I really, really like, and it's the Chaos Terminators have a power axe I think is pretty cool. And thankfully now it's just counted as a power weapon, because power axes have tended to suck ass, pardon my French. Again, excluding things like an Heresy where they're decent enough AP2 despite being unwieldy, and they're pretty cheap, usually. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. But I think power axes are fine. Never been my favorite, never been my least favorite, though. I will give it a B tier, because I think they can look cool, but it's pretty half and half on whether they do, because the short little war axes, like this one, while technically more accurate to what a war axe should be, honestly that head is still way too big to be a proper war axe, but it looks imposing, it looks threatening. But yeah, I just prefer power swords personally. Next up, we have the Las Cannon, absolute classic heavy weapon. This is, of course, what you see on Devastators, with the very strange sort of... I say it's strange, I really like it. It's effectively just a giant rifle. Space Marine heavy weapons have been doing that for a while, though, now. And it's just a cool design, right? The big scope makes it feel like an anti-tank sniper, or like an old anti-tank rifle, i.e. World War II, or World War I, sorry, anti-tank rifles were completely outdated by World War II. But I love the Las Cannon, right? I generally don't prefer it in things like tactical squads. I like Las Cannons with my Devastators, or heavy support squads if you're playing Heresy. And even then, I don't really like Heresy Las Cannons. I think they look silly. Regardless, again, getting sidetracked, I quite like the Las Cannon. I think it's a very cool anti-tank weapon, and in general it's a classic 40k weapon. What's there not to like? I'm going to be giving it an A tier. Next up, we have the Lightning Claw, personal favorite melee weapon of mine, or one of my favorites, I should say. They're very unique. They get across the sort of, effectively the Wolverine aesthetic, which is, I would bet money, where they got the idea for Lightning Claws. It's just like, yeah, Wolverine's cool, give them to Space Marines. Even though these have an extra claw, or they usually have an extra claw. Sometimes they do just have the 3 claws, i.e. Wolverine. But their rules are usually pretty fun, especially for the way I like to play. Getting to reroll wounds is always awesome. And they're just really cool on the tabletop, especially when they're posed in like the come at me pose. I think that's awesome. And in general, they just look awesome. They're, ginormous bladed gauntlets. They're like they're cool. They're rule of cool to the maximum. Like, did they make a lot of sense? No, they'd be extremely unwieldy, but that doesn't matter because they're awesome. I love Lightning Claws. I will be giving them an S tier, just above the Power Sword. Next up, we have the Melt-A-Gun, another classic special weapon, and one that I'm quite fond of. I love Melt-A weapons. Who doesn't love Melt-A weapons? Have a very storied history in 40k. Very awesome. And I will say, I do like this pattern the most. This sort of just bog standard Melt-A-Gun. And I mean, it's hard for me to go wrong. It's one of my favorite special weapons, great anti-tank firepower, and it's just a really cool look. It feels very futuristic. I just love the Melt-A-Gun. I'm going to be giving it an A tier as well. Just because I think, who doesn't like a Melt-A-Gun, right? Next up, we have the Plasma Pistol, the de facto Sergeant Pistol forever. The Plasma Pistol is okay. I like the Plasma Pistol more than most other pistols. But again, it's kind of one of those things where it just feels like the McDonald's Happy Meal version of a plasma gun, which again, not necessarily a bad thing, but more so just not exactly what I think of, though always very fun. And if you're not overcharging your plasma pistol, are you even playing the game right? And it's part of the plasma family, which I really quite like, so I can't really put this any lower than A tier. Love plasma pistols. They've always been, relatively handy as an upgrade on your standard bolt pistol if they're cheap enough. And they look cool. They add an extra bit of air of command to your sergeants or your captains, who they are most often wielded by. Next up, we have the classic Astartes pattern Flamer, and this is the coolest pattern of Flamer. I just love the underslung tank look, and the nozzle's very cool. The big thing on top, I think that's supposed to be like a secondary handle, if I'm not mistaken. Though I don't think I've ever seen a model posed holding it. They're always just, grabbing it on its under barrel grip. But yeah, I love the Flamer. It's very much like when I think of like the standard tactical Marines, it's usually like a flamer and then a bunch of bolter guys, and that's what I really like. Because that's what it feels like. It feels like a weapon you would see deployed with a squad, and it just feels right. I really like the flamer. I always have. And I'm probably going to give it an A tier. It's definitely one of my favorite special weapons. Now, I do like most of the special weapons, I will admit. I think they're very cool. But something about the flamer has just always felt very right. I'm actually going to move the las cannon down to here. And I love the form factor. It's just so... I don't know how to explain it. It's such an intrinsic thing. Ever since I was a kid, a little kid, when I first saw my older brother's Space Marines, I just loved the look of the flamers in the tactical squads. They just feel so right. Next up, we have the multi-melta. 2 meltas taped together. It's peak. Pure cinema. You know the picture. I think it's Scorsese doing it. But it's such a great heavy weapon. Of course, been very good for a very long time. Iconic, not only for the Space Marines, also for the Sisters. And the multi-melta is just so cool, isn't it? It's just, it's awesome. It's 2 meltas strapped together. Love the melta gun. Multi-melta, I should say. I'll be giving it, though, probably an A tier. Well, I love the multi-melta. I kind of just like the regular melta more. There's something it feels nimble. I think that's part of what I really like about some of the special weapons, is they just feel nimble. They feel right. Next up, we have the plasma cannon. And I like the plasma cannon. You see these on your Devastators, and on Leman Russes, usually. I think it's a cool look. Personally, I think the plasma cannons could probably do with a slight change. I think they would be better off with a heavy bolter style of holding, or just something like that. I have a few Devastators with plasma cannons. They've served me well for a few editions now. And they look cool. I mean, plasma guns just allow you to have a splash of fun color, but I will admit I tend to like the lighter plasma weaponry more than the humongous man-portable ones, because there's sort of like the plasma cannon's a cool plasma gun, but I prefer plasma guns to it on infantry, and on tanks, I prefer the huge plasma guns, i.e. Leman Russ Executioner. Yeah, plasma cannon, though, great weapon. I'm going to put it right behind the plasma pistol. Next up, we have the plasma gun. This is a plasma incinerator from the Primaris Marines, but it's the best-looking plasma gun they've ever produced, so I'm just going with that. I'm not sure what it is about these plasma guns that is just so perfect to me, but I think they get the roundness down right. But that's another discussion. Plasma guns, though, so cool. Love plasma guns. Super fun to paint. They're very striking. They add in a huge splash of color if you paint them correctly, as I say. I will say, though, if you paint your plasma guns with just, like, silver coils, they do not look nearly as cool. They lose almost all of their unique personality. I love these guys, though. I love plasma guns in general. Will say not the biggest fan of the Heresy version of plasma guns, but that's, neither here nor there, really. I will be giving these guys an S tier. I love plasma guns. They're so cool, and if you're not overcharging, you're not doing it right. Next up, we have the missile launcher. So the missile launcher is... it's a missile launcher. There's really not much to say about it. It's effectively just a big tube. I will say I really like the backpacks that come with the missile launchers. So they have those robotic arms for reloading, which is very cool. Obviously, they've served as sort of the flexible jack-of-all-trades weapon. They used to have a blast template and a heavy one shot, of course. And then they moved to the 2 profiles we see them with today. And I think missile launchers, they're probably my second favorite heavy weapon for tactical squads, just behind the heavy bolter. And, I mean, they look cool, right? They're just, they look like a rocket launcher, And rocket launchers have been, a symbol in games of power for a long time, even though I wouldn't say the rocket launcher's ever shaken the world with how devastating it is. It's always been a rather middling weapon, all things considered, but it's also been a cheap weapon. Will say, this pattern is really the only missile launcher I think looks particularly good. I think the Heresy ones look dumb. And obviously the sort of black box design for the Desolation Marines, I don't hate it as much as most people do, but it's still, you can't beat the classic shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. I think the rocket launcher, though, is a fine heavy weapon. It feels like, similar to the Flamer, it just feels right in a tactical squad, which makes sense. They've been packaged with tactical squads for longer than I've been alive. yeah, rocket launchers, old reliable. You can always count on a rocket launcher to look good and do its job, the minimum amount. It clocks out early. But rocket launchers, totally fine. Love the look, though I honestly kind of wish they had always been more impactful, as I always feel like my rocket launchers either, well, back in the day, they scattered off in a random direction, or they just bounced off of high armor values, which pretty much the same as they are today. Next up, we have the Thunder Hammer, which is a weapon that's slowly going extinct, it feels like, in the Space Marine armory, which is certainly a shame, because the Thunder Hammer is pretty cool. It's really an interesting take on a Warhammer. This is it. This is John Warhammer. Mainly because they're usually one-handed weapons, outside of the Death Watch, when you generally associate giant hammers as two-handed. But I don't mind. I think the Thunder Hammer has looked cool forever. Of course, Terminator Assault Squads, I imagine they will have it when they get their update. You can't get rid of that. That's one of their loadouts. And they just pair really well with Storm Shields. They look really good on Terminators mainly. Not the biggest fan of it on normal Marines, though I did used to have one on my Vanguard Veteran Sergeant, which I think looked pretty good. To me, these are a Terminator exclusive weapon. That's where they look their best. That's where I think they're at their best, is on Terminators. I'll be giving it, though, probably an A tier. Yeah, I'll be giving it an A tier. I like it, but it's not my favorite. It's not as elegant, and it's not as striking as some of the other melee weapons. But, it's a big thunder hammer that hits people real hard with powers. Next up, we have the Heavy Flamer, and I've never been the biggest Heavy Flamer fan. I will say the new Terminators, I like their Heavy Flamer, and I like the Pyre Cannon from the Sternguard Veterans. But the classic archetypal Heavy Flamer that you saw on Sternguard Veterans, on Devastator Squads, things like that, I don't think they look the best. They're kind of, they're not as cool as Multi-Meltas is the main thing. I've just never been a big Heavy Flamer guy. I think I just prefer the look of the normal Flamer. We'll say, the Catachan Command Squad, I like their Heavy Flamer because it's just a normal Flamer doubled up, which is just a funny look. But that's not what we're covering. We're not covering Guard, we're covering Space Marines. It's a fine weapon, but it's just not one I ever think about. When I think heavy weapons, what do I go to? Las Cannon, Multi-Melta, Heavy Bolter, all of those, Missile Launcher. And then eventually I'm like, oh yeah, the Heavy Flamer exists. It feels kind of pointless to have a Heavy Flamer unless it's bolted to the side of something. Regardless, I'll be giving it a C tier. Sorry, Heavy Flamer fans. Next up, we have the Combi Bolter, the classic weapon of Terminators and captains everywhere. The Combi Bolter is two bolters strapped together with a big box magazine, and you know what that means? It's cool, because box magazines are cool, even though they don't make any sense. And it's really bulky, got the huge casing, giant muzzles. It's two bolters strapped together. What's there not to like? Granted, not as elegant as the regular bolter. I'll be giving it an S tier, though. And to go with it, the Power Fist. I'm putting this right behind the Chainsword, as I feel the Power Fist is the other iconic Space Marine melee weapon. The favorite of sergeants everywhere. When I think back to my brother's Space Marines, it was either the sergeant had a Chainsword or he had Power Fist. Those are the two that come to mind. And the Power Fist has served forever as a great melee weapon. Even when it was, unwieldy, it still had its place in just instant deathing so much and punching vehicles real good. Love the Power Fist. It's a classic weapon, and it's always going to serve you well. You'll very rarely find a time where a Power Fist can't get the job done. And that's what makes the Power Fist great. It's always at your side. And it's on Terminators. Terminators are cool, so therefore, it's cool. Anyways, this is more of a fun, lighthearted video reflecting on the weapons of Space Marines. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to let me know what you thought down below. Did I rank anything too high, too low? Tell me what you would change, and I'll see you all next time.